Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Mina and today's video is going to be a recommendation video. I have been wanting to do a few recommendation videos for a while now. I'm saving most of them for like the autumn spooky season coming up, but I figured why not start doing one of them now. And this video is going to be some horror book recommendations, but the catch is that these recommendations are perfect for people who don't usually like to read horror. So people who I guess are either too afraid to read horror or they're just beginning and kind of like dipping their toes into the genre and they're not sure exactly where to start, or people who just generally do not like the horror genre but they want to have some kind of horror elements within their reading and kind of start getting into the genre. So I do have about 7 or 8 books here to recommend to you guys, and for each one of them I'm going to explain to you what the book is about and then also why I think it would be a good recommendation for somebody who is just starting out or somebody who's looking for light horror. Most of these books have that kind of like light horror element to them. They're not like totally terrifying. They're not like the scariest books I've ever read. They're not like super gory. They don't have like really creepy moments. They just have very light, minimal horror-esque elements to them. So yeah, that is what I am going to be recommending to you guys in this video. I know that I have a lot of subscribers who watch my videos because they actually do like to read horror. So this video is not really for you guys. I mean, unless you haven't read any of these books, I do recommend them, but it's mainly for the people who watch my videos who are saying that they always wanted to start getting into horror or they want to try reading something out of their comfort zone, but they're not sure exactly where they want to begin. So these recommendations are for you guys. So let's go ahead and get started. The first 3 books that I have are actually young adult picks, and the reason why I decided to include some young adult picks in here is because there are actually some really strong horror young adult books that I have read recently. And one of the things that works really well with young adult horror is that a lot of times the authors will not go too heavy when it comes to the scares. They won't go too heavy when it comes to the violence or the gore. It's very minimal in terms of like the horror elements in them. They're a little bit more tame than some of the adult horror books that I've read before. So the first one that I want to recommend to you guys is one that I have been recommending since I read it last year, and that is Burn Our Bodies Down by Rory Powers. This is kind of like a surreal horror novel, if that makes sense. It's very like eerie and it has a very strong like unsettling tone to it throughout. It is about a young woman who doesn't really know anything about her family. It's just her and her mom. She doesn't know where she comes from. She doesn't know her ancestors, her lineage, any of her like extended family, has no idea like who they are. One day she does find some clues as to who her grandmother is, and she decides to follow those clues and go to her mom's hometown in order to meet her grandmother. Once she gets there, however, it's a very like small town where everybody knows each other's business, and she starts to encounter some weird and eerie, creepy things in this small town, and it leads up to a finale that was just so satisfying for me and I thought was just super creepy. Not to the point where like you can't sleep at night, but there's definitely some interesting imagery in here. There's very little like body horror. Like it's not too intense, it's not too gory, but it's very weird. And like when you get to the end, you're just gonna be like that's how I felt when I was reading it. It is such an interesting read and it's definitely like a unique read to me, and I'm always looking for books that have like weird, strange elements to them. So I feel like this is a good entry into horror because it's not super scary, but it does have some like creepy, eerie moments throughout. So definitely recommend this one. Love this book so much. The next YA horror book that I want to recommend to you guys is Horrid by Katrina Leno, and this is like the perfect gothic YA horror book. It takes place in a small, sleepy seaside town, and it follows a girl and her mom who are moving back to that town after living, I think they lived in like a bigger city before, but they're moving back to this old town because they have just inherited the home of the girl's grandparents who have recently passed away. And the girl starts to realize that there are some secrets involving her family, particularly with a locked room in the house. And she starts to wonder, like, why is this room locked? Like, what happened to my family? And she starts to get clues that something creepy and weird happened to her family when her mom was younger, and she's trying to figure out what exactly happened. So it does have like a mystery element to it. All of these books that I'm going to recommend are heavily like mystery involved, if that makes sense. And this one is a supernatural story, so there are some elements in here that are like paranormal. I'm not going to go into details about what exactly you see in this book, but you know, just know that this is a supernatural story, and it has some very chilling moments. There's definitely some imagery in here that's like very haunting, very beautiful, again, very weird. So I do recommend this one. It's not overly scary. I think it's definitely a book that you could see on like Disney Channel or like ABC Family or something, like them translating this book into like a teen spooky Halloween movie. That's kind of like the vibe that I felt when reading this book, and it just has such a beautiful like eerie atmosphere that just like is perfect for the Halloween season. So definitely recommend this one if you were looking for something that's kind of gothic, kind of spooky, kind of haunted house related. The next book that I want to recommend is actually one that I have read recently and I really enjoyed, and that is The Mary Shelley Club by Goldie Moldavsky. And this is a book that is very interesting. It is marketed as being a mix of Scream, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, and a mix of Gossip Girl, which I've never watched, but I do understand like where that comparison comes from. So this is kind of like a dark academia vibe book. It follows a group of kids who go to this fancy, rich, like prep school in Manhattan, and there is this secret society known as the Mary Shelley Club, and these kids like to pull pranks, like pranks based on people's fears, and some things start to go wrong during their pranks, and they start to believe that something sinister is at work, somebody is going against them in some way, and I'm just gonna leave it at that in terms of the plot. But this was such a fun ride. I normally do not like books that take place in like a school or like academic setting, because I have been through so much school in my life and I'm a teacher, and it's just like sometimes I just want to escape from that type of environment. But this one was so good. It kept me interested. It is fairly long, so the like horror or scarier elements don't occur until later on in the novel. The beginning is mostly setup, and it's mostly just like mystery, and you're trying to find out who the Mary Shelley Club is and like what do they do. But it's a very interesting read. I thought that all of the kids in the Mary Shelley Club group were very interesting to follow. There were some intriguing perspectives in here, and there was a scene in here that felt very much like a slasher film, so that's why I feel like it has those horror vibes in there, but not overly bloody, not overly gory. So I think that people who are not used to the slasher genre or used to horror can still enjoy this book and still feel like they're getting a little bit of horror elements in there, even though this isn't like super scary or super gory. Also, just want to shout out my awesome t-shirt. It says Save Halloween, and it's got like a bunch of people dressed up in their Halloween costumes around like a seance circle and the Headless Horseman. I absolutely love it. I haven't worn it. I don't think I've worn it yet, and I've had this shirt for like an entire year. I got it during COVID last year when we were still in quarantine, and like the whole purpose of this shirt is like stay indoors so that we can like go out on Halloween, save Halloween, but I love it. Okay, so the next books that I have are adult fiction. They're not young adult, so they're a little bit more intense in some ways, not all of them. The first one that I want to recommend to you guys is actually a Stephen King pick, because I was like, I need to include at least one Stephen King book on this list, and that is Misery. Misery is one of the books that I always recommend to people if they want to start reading Stephen King but they don't know where to start, because I feel like Misery is very digestible for people, and it's not overly scary, and it's not super long, and it's just like an easy, fun read, in my opinion, and it was one of the books that I read when I was first getting into Stephen King, and I did not have a difficult time getting through this one at all. So if you don't know the story of Misery, Misery follows a writer, a famous writer, who gets into a very severe car accident one day and gets stranded in a snowstorm, and the woman who rescues him happens to be his #1 fan, and she's a little bit psychotic, and she decides that she is going to hold him hostage in her home and make him rewrite the ending of one of the books that she was disappointed in. And she basically keeps him there until he finishes this book, or she's planning to keep him there until he finishes this book. So it's more of like a psychological type of horror. There is a little bit of violence and gore in here, but not to the point where like you're reading about blood and guts and like really disturbing, gruesome imagery. But there is a pretty intensely violent scene in here, but nothing crazy. I think that this one plays more with like your mind, because you're kind of in the head of the writer who is being held hostage, and he's looking for ways to escape. So it's more of like a mental, psychological horror than it is anything like supernatural or gory or slasher. It's not like that. So I think that people who are more comfortable with like thrillers and psychological type of plots would enjoy this one a little bit more, and it still delivers like the heart-pounding suspense, the fear that you get from reading horror without it being over the top. So definitely recommend Misery. Okay, so the next book that I'm recommending is actually one that I wasn't crazy about, but I feel like it would work very well on this list, and I think that people who want to read horror but again don't know where to start or are afraid to start it would actually find this to be a good pick. And that is The Haunting of Bryn Wilder by Wendy Webb. This is a book that I thought was going to be like super scary. I was going into it expecting like Haunting of Hill House vibes. It's not like that at all. It's very light on the horror, very light on the scares. So I think that a lot of people can handle this read if you want just a little bit of like supernatural surrealism in your reading. This is about a woman who goes to a small town for the summer and stays in a boarding house to kind of like get away from her life problems. And when she's there, she starts to realize that there's something kind of off with some of the residents in the boarding house, and she starts to suspect that maybe the boarding house has some kind of supernatural presence or force within it. What I think is interesting about this book, and that works really well with my list here, is that it definitely doesn't like scare you with the ghost aspect of this book. It's a lot more like dramatized, and I would say like hauntingly beautiful, if that makes sense. Like that's kind of the vibe that I felt when reading this. It wasn't like, oh my god, I'm so scared of like the ghosts. It's more so like mysterious, eerie, and there's a lot involving like dreams and how you can kind of like envision certain things and the question of whether or not you're dreaming or whether it's reality. There's that kind of horror within this novel. So I don't think that anybody who you know, cannot handle horror or who's really afraid of horror, I don't think that you guys would not be able to handle this. I think that this is a pretty tame type of horror. I don't even think that this is technically categorized as a horror novel, but like I said, I think that it delivers a little bit of creep factor in there that you can consider this as like an entry into horror. The next book that I want to recommend to you guys is The Sundown Motel by Simone St. James. I absolutely love this book. I think that this is an excellent supernatural read, and I didn't actually know that this was going to be supernatural going into it. I thought it was more of a mystery thriller, and it definitely reads like a mystery thriller for a majority of this book, which is why I think that this is a good pick for people who are not used to horror, because for the majority of this book, 80% of it, you definitely feel like you're following a mystery and trying to unravel secrets from the past and you know, just like discover information. So it's a lot less intense than some of the supernatural books that I've read, which is why I think that this would be a good pick. This is about a young woman who is trying to go back and investigate what happened to her missing aunt. And it takes place in two timelines. We have the present day with our main character who's trying to find out what happened, and then we have the perspective of the young woman's aunt back in the 80s. So it does have some nice like 80s vibes in here, which I really like. And you're kind of like going through the timeline of like what happened to her aunt leading up to her disappearance, and then in the present tense discovering clues about what happened to her. This takes place in kind of like a rundown motel off the side of the road, like nobody goes here. It's kind of like almost abandoned, and it has very like creepy and eerie vibes to it, but I don't think that this is like a terrifying story. So again, I feel like if you are somebody who gets easily spooked by like supernatural stories or ghosts, things like that, you can definitely still handle this one, especially because it takes so long to get to the actual supernatural elements of this book that I think you'll just be sucked into the mystery and like trying to find out what happened to the aunt. So definitely recommend this one. Such a great read and such a beautiful cover. And the last book that I want to recommend to you guys is World War Z by Max Brooks. This one is a little bit more well known in the horror genre, but I think that this one is not going to terrify you. So I read this book twice, and the first time that I read this book, I did not like it. I was like, this isn't even scary, this is boring, I'm not interested in it. And then I read it a second time for school when I took a zombie literature class, and studying this book with my professor and with our class, I was able to appreciate it a little bit more for what it is. This is written in a very interesting way. It's kind of like a mixed media format. We're basically getting interviews between the government and people who have experienced this zombie apocalypse that plagued the world. So we're getting perspectives from people all over the world in different countries. What was their experience like leading up to the apocalypse and during the apocalypse and after this zombie apocalypse? There's definitely some kind of intense like zombie scenes in here, but not to the point where I think you'll be totally freaked out. I'm also somebody who doesn't get like super scared by like creatures, zombies, supernatural beings like that is not something that really terrifies me. So I think if you're like me and you're not like totally scared of those things, then you'll be able to handle this book. And I also feel like because it is written in the interview style format, we kind of feel a little bit removed from the action. At least I did when I was reading this. It's not like you're reading from like first person perspective while the zombie apocalypse is happening and like it's going on right in that moment and you feel like you're there within the action. This feels a little bit more distant from the horror, so that's why I feel like people would be able to handle this if you're not totally into horror. When I thought that it was boring in the beginning, like the first time I read this, it's very like historical. It almost feels like a historical textbook catalog or like somebody's statistics, like their research. It's definitely like it has this research vibe to it. So that's why I thought that it was boring the first time that I read it. But I think upon my second read, I was really able to appreciate the way that this was written and how unique that was. And I think that it definitely stands out in the horror genre as something that is original and different. So that's why I recommend it. But it is a slow read, it is quite long. And I just think that if you do not want to read something super scary, but you still want to get in a little bit of creep factor for like the Halloween season, I would recommend reading World War Z. The movie sucked. Don't watch the movie, but the book is much better. Okay, so that is it for all of my light horror recommendations. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know down below if you have some other recommendations for books that you think would be good for people who don't tend to pick up horror normally. There are so many books that I could recommend, but of course I wanted to stick to things that I think would be more digestible and easier for people to read if this is like their first horror book, or if you're somebody who typically gets scared easily from reading horror. I think these would be quite tame for you, and they're good books. Like, I've read them all, and even though a couple of them were not like my all-time faves, I still think that they're worth checking out. And again, especially if you're a person who does not normally read horror, you can definitely go into these books and feel like you're reading some amount of horror but not get like super overwhelmed by it. So that's it for this video, and I will see you guys very soon in my next video. I hope that everybody has a wonderful day today. Bye guys!